Hi, everybody. Welcome to Making the Grade. I'm Michelle Edmonds from Idaho News 6, along with Kevin Richard from Idaho Education News. So good to have all of you with us on this Tuesday morning. We are going to talk about a couple of really fascinating topics. Kevin has been doing a series this week that if you haven't gone to idahoednews.org yet and started to read along, or if you've not been getting your updates on your app or wherever else you may be getting Idaho Education News updates, you definitely need to be doing that. But before we get there, Kevin, I want to kind of backtrack with you to some interesting stuff that happened the end of last week. And you had written about the surplus that the state now has. We won't know the exact surplus of tax money that the state will have until the end of the month. But we're looking at close to almost $800 million in surplus. And so I want to talk about where that money could possibly be going when it comes to education. And this takes us a lot of places, doesn't it?
It really does, because $800 million can take you a lot of places, right? That is the forecast right now for the end of year surplus. And the number has just continued to grow over the past few months. And you're right, we won't know the precise figure until sometime after July 1st, sometime after the books close on this current budget year. That ends on June 30th. So stay tuned for the exact number, but what we know right now is that it's an unprecedented sum of money. We've never had a surplus of this magnitude in the state's history. And Governor Little, a couple of weeks ago, as these new numbers started to come in, he suggested that he wants to do several things with this surplus. He wants to look at additional tax relief. We've already seen income tax relief. We saw widespread, a far-reaching property tax bill that was signed into law at the end of the session. He wants to do more tax relief. He wants to put some more money into education. Didn't really say exactly where he would want to put that money into education, but there are a lot of different options out there in just that arena.
If you're just joining us for Making the Grade, we're talking about an $800 million surplus and where the state should spend that money. If you have thoughts or comments or questions, we'd love to take them as we're here live on the Idaho News 6 social media platforms. Love to get your thoughts as you're joining us. Kevin, let's start with one of the big topics that came up in the legislature when it comes to spending surplus in education. Some of the idea has to be going to doing all-day kindergarten. And the State Board of Education certainly seems to be on board with this plan.
Yeah, I think it's another step in the momentum towards all-day kindergarten. So the State Board of Education met last week, and you got to remember, State Board of Education is made up largely of gubernatorial appointees. The board voted unanimously to recommend that the state board pursue all-day kindergarten as a legislative priority in 2022. Now, they still would need Governor Little to sign on to the idea of pursuing this and fleshing out the details. If the governor signs on it, and there's a pretty good chance he will, the state board will be talking about this more in August at its next meeting, setting the stage as we get closer, into the fall, setting the stage for the 2022 legislative session. There's already been a lot of talk about all-day kindergarten. There was a bill that was presented towards the end of the 2021 session that would have funded all-day kindergarten. There's been a lot of talk about this from the School Boards Association, from the governor's Governor Little's education task force going back to his first year in office. So there's quite a bit of sentiment behind the idea of all-day kindergarten for a couple of reasons. The idea that it's going to help young students learn to read at grade level, get them prepared to read at grade level, get them socialized into the classroom more. But it's also viewed as a possible way to get some property tax relief around the state, because a lot of school districts are already doing all-day kindergarten, and a lot of them are using property taxes to pay for it. These supplemental levies that they have to go back to voters for every year or two to renew. The idea of state funding for all-day kindergarten is billed as also a way of getting some property tax relief at the local level. So there's quite a bit of support behind the idea of all-day kindergarten.
And I'd throw in a third idea behind all-day kindergarten, and that coming from some of the education groups in the state too, saying that it's just more fair, because if some districts charge in order to have an all-day kindergarten, I mean, they literally charge parents in some school districts, that's not really fair according to our Constitution for a fair and equal opportunity in education for every Idaho student if some families can't afford that extra payment.
Definitely. It's definitely an equity issue. When you start to talk about tuition, you have to then look at the ability to pay. And for different families, different households, there's a different ability to pay. There's no getting around that.
What else do you think might start floating to the surface here? Because as we talk about all-day kindergarten, and you're going to have to remind me here, but if I remember correctly, the bill that was kind of tossed around at the end of the legislative session was showing that all-day kindergarten would cost the state maybe around $50 million. I don't know if I'm getting those numbers right.
So yeah, I've seen the number higher than 42 million in past years, but yeah, that you're talking about, tens of millions of dollars. But in the context of an $800 million surplus, it certainly falls under the salary cap, if you will.
So what else could possibly be tossed around when it comes to that $800 million surplus in spending it in education?
Oh, wow. You ask different people in the education space, get different answers, different priorities. I spoke to the School Boards Association. One of their concerns is classified salaries, classified staff. This is, these aren't teachers, but these are your school bus drivers, your cafeteria staff, your paraprofessionals who do spend time in the classroom, who do work with kids. School districts are having a hard time hanging on to these classified employees because they're having a hard time paying them a wage that's competitive. The labor shortage that we're hearing about in so many sectors in the state right now, education's feeling it as well. So the School Boards Association would love to see that addressed. State Superintendent Sherry Ibarra would like to see some other items addressed. The state has gotten away from funding some of the education line items that they've established. They've cut some funding for items such as technology, teacher training. She would like to see those line items restored so that the school districts aren't having to pick up the slack at the local level. When I talked to Rod Grammer from the Idaho Business for Education, he said his membership would be very interested in all-day kindergarten, but they're also interested in pre-K. They're also interested in early education. And we know what happened with early education and that federal grant from the 2021 legislative session. So, you ask enough people about where money could go into education in 2022, you're going to get a lot of different answers. And all of a sudden, the money starts to become a little bit tight when people have different programs that they would like to turn into priorities.
So Kevin, as we wrap up this topic, because you have covered the legislature for so long, when you look at a surplus, a possible record surplus for the state of Idaho when it comes to a pot of money, does it make it easier or harder for lawmakers to make decisions about where it's spent?
Tougher, definitely tougher. I've covered lean years of the legislature and I've covered years like this where there's a surplus and I think it's tougher. It doesn't necessarily mean a longer session, but it means a tougher session because, like we're talking about, everybody comes in with their hopes, with their priorities. And they're not just priorities and hopes in education. So when you have all these competing interests and all these competing demands for what is still a finite amount of money, it's a big sum of money, but it's a finite sum of money. It makes for a tougher session. There's no question about that.
And let's not forget that 2022 is also an election year.
Yeah, there's that too. That always makes for a tougher legislative session as well.
All right, stay tuned, everybody. We'll have more numbers for you coming up in July about what that looks like. And also, as we approach that August State Board of Education meeting, be interested to hear if Governor Little makes decisions on all-day kindergarten. Kevin, the Missing Students Investigation. That's what you titled this week-long series that you have been working on, I know personally, for months. And I said this to you privately, I will say it publicly right now. It is excellent work. And I would say if anybody has not had the chance to read it yet, idahoednews.org is definitely the place to go. Before we jump into what exactly you found during this investigation, What did you decide to study, and why did you decide to study this topic in particular?
Well, we decided we wanted to look at higher education enrollment during the pandemic, and we decided this early in the year. We knew that the forecasts right out of the gate, right as the pandemic hit in the spring of 2020, were dire forecasts of an extreme drop-off in enrollment. I mean, we had national experts expecting or predicting a 20% drop-off in enrollment, which would have devastating effects on colleges and universities and college and university budgets, because so much of their budgets are tied to bringing students in and collecting tuition and fees from students and their parents. Well, what we found out, we found the 5,000 missing students. That's the number that we've hit on. The colleges and universities, the public colleges and universities here, saw an 8.7% decline in enrollment from the fall of 2019, the pre-pandemic semester. So not 20%, but 8.7% is still a significant drop-off. That's where we get that 5,000 student figure. That's where we talk about the 5,000 missing students, because that's what we've seen in terms of the drop-off. But Michelle, sometimes the numbers only tell you part of the story. And as we crunched the numbers and as we started to talk to the college and university officials about what's happening, what we saw is a lot of the drop-off was occurring in the kind of student cohorts, the kind of student groups that the colleges and universities are really trying to attract. In-state students, rural students, first-generation college students, students who would be eligible for federal financial aid. So you've got students coming from lower income households. We've seen kind of mixed numbers in terms of Latino enrollment during the pandemic, but in all of those cohorts that I mentioned before, you're seeing fairly significant drop-offs, and you're seeing fairly significant drop-offs almost across the board. Almost every institution is struggling in one way or another to bring in those kind of students. And when we did this graphic, the thing I really wanted to focus in on was the mix between in-state and out-of-state enrollment. If we can just kind of freeze on Boise State, and when you go onto the website, trust me, you can go and you can click on these bar graphs and you get the actual numbers. But I can tell you, having been playing with these numbers and researching these numbers for months, that Boise State has seen a significant increase in out-of-state enrollment. It's really how they have weathered the enrollment storm to some degree during the pandemic. Now, they still lost over 1,000 students, as you see in this graphic, but the loss would have been even greater if they hadn't attracted more out-of-state students. Now, why are there students coming from out of state into Idaho? Well, a big reason is students wanted to make sure, or they wanted to have a better probability of in-person learning. So the Idaho colleges and universities really focused on trying to provide in-person learning to some degree, at least to some extent during the pandemic. Other colleges and universities around the country went all online and stayed all online. So that's been a draw for schools like Boise State during this pandemic. But really, Boise State has seen this out-of-state enrollment increase occurring even before the pandemic. This is a trend that's been going on for several years. The pandemic has maybe accelerated it, has heightened it. And you can see now, we're clicking on the numbers. You can see what's happened in terms of non-resident versus resident. And I focus on that because what it means is, it doesn't mean that in-state students are squeezed out, okay? That's a very important thing to note. If an Idaho student applies to Boise State or University of Idaho and meets the admission requirements, there's a spot for that student. But what you are seeing is, as more out-of-state students are filling these spots, you have a college campus that maybe doesn't look quite as much like the state that it serves. It's a demographic shift.
Kevin, is it also a money shift? Because obviously, if you have more students who are coming from out of state, they're paying the out of state tuition rates, which are much higher.
Right. A lot of them are paying that full higher tuition as out-of-state students. Some of them are coming in that Western undergraduate exchange, where they're still paying more than an in-state student. I think it's 150% of in-state tuition that the students in the Western undergraduate exchange or WUI program pay. So yes, they are paying more. So there is that is part of the equation as well. But it's interesting to note. We talk a little bit about it in the series. The colleges and universities have frozen tuition for a second year. That goes into effect this next fall. They also froze tuition and fees in many cases for out-of-state students as well. So, yeah, I think, as I talked to the college and university officials for this series, a lot of them are really just trying to figure out, how do we reach out to these in-state students? How do we bring them back? And how do we bring back students who we lost touch with in 2020 over the course of the pandemic? How do we find them? How do we get them back? How do we get them to, re-engage in their dreams of going to college? So there are a lot of challenges that the colleges and universities are facing. As we roll out this series tomorrow, Wednesday, our focus will be on what do the numbers look like for next year, and a lot of the indications are pretty troubling.
Mm-hmm. It's going to be a long-term study in these numbers too, to see what happens when they bounce back, how that looks. I want to shift to some of the more personal stories that you've been able to tell, though, through this series. And I think this is obviously where you kind of get boots on the ground and get a look at what students have had to face, Idaho college students have had to face in this past year, going to school in a pandemic, why they decided to make the decisions they made. Kevin, can you highlight maybe a story or two of some kids who I know you were impressed by them all, but what really stood out to you?
Yes, it was fascinating and really powerful to talk to students about their experiences. And, one of the things that I heard over and over from students was, I would ask them, did you consider taking a gap year? Did you consider taking this year off to see how things rode out? And some of the students I spoke to said, I just want to get started. This has been my plan all along. I do not want to take a year off. One student I spoke to said, I want to be done in 4 years and I want to graduate debt-free. And I have a scholarship for 4 years. So if I take a gap year, am I going to have that scholarship available to me? And this is the student I'm talking about, Knox Friedman. He's a Treasure Valley student going to Idaho State University. And as I talked to the international students at the College of Idaho, and that's a story we're going to roll out on Thursday, they said, look, we can't take time off. We're here on a student visa, and our student visa is tied to our enrollment in college. So a gap year is just not an option for international students. So as I talked to these students, taking a year off was not really an option. They weren't terribly excited about online learning, having mixed online learning into their portfolio. Most of the students I spoke to, and this is anecdotal, this isn't a scientific study by any stretch, but the students I talked to said, much rather be in a face-to-face classroom. I'd much rather have that interaction with my classmates and with my instructor, but you do what you got to do. And as I talked to some of these students too, and I talked about the pandemic and the protocols and the safeguards, the students I spoke to, some of them said, I'm not a big fan of wearing a mask. I can't wait to not wear a mask. But if this is what it takes, if this is what the school requires, we'll do it. So, Michelle, I was just struck as I talked to these students about what they've had to face and the decisions that they've had to make about their college, their education, the health risks that are attached to the pandemic, not just for them, but for their parents, their grandparents. These are kids. I mean, that's a pejorative term. These are young adults who are dealing with something much more complicated than I had to deal with when I was their age. I mean, they've really had to come to grips with some tough decisions, some tough circumstances. And they're not feeling sorry for themselves either. When you talk to them and say, okay, this is the situation. It is what it is, but I'm still going to school and it's still important to me and we're making the best of it. And, when I ask them, well, what do you hope for in the fall? What do you want in the fall? And it's the simple stuff that we all enjoyed when we went to college. It's, going out with friends and not having to worry about it, going to a football game and not, having to be concerned about being 6 feet apart from everybody. It's the impromptu stuff that makes the college experience an experience. That's what they're missing. And, it was really moving to talk to these students and get their perspectives. And, I hope, the words and I hope the videos that we present these next couple of days do their stories justice, because, I think readers need to hear from the students about what they've been through and their outlook over this past year and their outlook going forward. It's very moving.
I think the word, if I had a takeaway after reading what you wrote, what the kids, and I use the word kids too, that shows that we're just old, Kev. I hate to say it, but so far
we feel like kids, but they're young adults. Yeah.
But the word that I came away from is that they have a grit in them that is undeniable. And I think, and again, I am just speaking my own heart here, but if anything, that grit is going to do great things for our future as a state.
Yeah, if you can persevere what you've been through as young adults these past 12, 15, 18 months, if you can get through this, you can get through a lot. And, I should say that this is a series that we're doing this week. We're going to come back in the fall. We're going to take another look at it. I'm looking forward to talking to some of these students again about, okay, how's it been going the past few months? Is it, how's the experience changing, and how are classes this time around? How is campus life this time around? So they're great. They're great young people to talk to, and it's a real reality check. It's, you look at the numbers, you can look at the numbers, you can crunch the statistics, all you want. You can talk to the college and university administrators and get their wisdom. But you hear from the students and you're hearing, the real story. I mean, here's a student I spoke to who graduated from University of Idaho last month, Sierra Brantz, and her senior year was not what she expected coming in. I think, her experience is probably like a lot of college seniors. And, she said, well, I'm glad I wasn't a freshman. I'm glad I was established when I was on campus for the pandemic year.
I love those photos. Kevin, we got one comment here from Jana, and this goes back to what we were talking about with out-of-state students coming, especially to Boise State. And she's saying, please elaborate on what you mean that the campus doesn't fit the demographic it serves. Can you speak to this a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm getting at here, and it's not a seismic shift right now, Jana, but what I'm talking about is that you're seeing a transition. I mean, you're seeing a slightly higher percentage of students coming in from out of state as opposed to students coming in from in-state. And you're seeing, I would say, even within the students from in-state that are going on to college, if you're seeing fewer students who are from rural Idaho or are their, first of their generation, first in their family to go to college, or students who are qualifying for financial aid, if those numbers are tailing off or dropping, and in a lot of cases they have been during the pandemic, even the students you're getting from in-state, it's not quite representative of the whole of the student body of Idaho. It's students maybe from Boise or West Ada or Nampa. Maybe they're maybe their folks went to college. Maybe they're third, fourth generation college students. Maybe they have a little bit more of a financial backing from their family. Maybe they come from a little bit more secure financial background. And I'm not disparaging these students at all. I'm not downplaying the challenges that they face as students. I'm just saying that if that is your student population, if that becomes a growing share of your student population, you're leaving other students out of the picture. That's all I'm saying. I mean, you know, I'm not suggesting that Idaho College campuses are completely out of touch with the state that they serve, but you're seeing a shift, and it's, not a seismic shift, but it's a noticeable one, and it's something that we should be thinking about as Idahoans. Is this a concern going forward, and to what extent are we concerned about it going forward?
And Kevin, it goes back to what you and I have reported on for years now here on Making the Grade. And we've done our own series together on the go on rates, high schoolers who need to try, and the state wants them to try and go on. And a lot of those groups that they have focused on, in-state groups, have been those that have not had necessarily the opportunity or the exposure to go on to a 2-year or a 4-year institution in state. And there have been so many programs and money, taxpayer money, thrown at this number one education goal. So all of this plays into this mix that you're talking about here.
Right. So let's recap that number, because it's an important one to remember. 38% of high school graduates from last year went straight on to college. And that was about, I want to say, 7 percentage points lower than we'd seen in preceding years. And, when I talked to the college officials about that go-on rate and asked them, it goes back to this missing students title of the series. When I talked to Boise State, what they believe with the students who didn't go on, the Idaho students who decided not to go to college, who decided not to attend college in Idaho, in most cases, they didn't attend college anywhere. It's not like they went to a school out of state. They are really sitting it out. And, Boise State, and I'm sure the other institutions would tell you the same thing. Now they're trying to figure out, well, how do we find these students? How do we reach out to them? How do we say, I know you sat out last year, but we'd love to get you back on campus. We'd love to get you on campus. How do we, reconnect? So, that go-on rate last year, I think, was a wake-up call to a lot of college and university officials. To see that kind of a drop-off in 1 year was pretty dramatic.
Well, again, if you haven't had a chance to jump on board and read Kevin's series, head to idahoednews.org. It is all there. There's some great videos attached. You obviously saw some of the graphs and charts, and I love that we can dig down ourselves in those numbers, Kevin. So excellent work to you and the staff at Idaho Ed News, because I know you're not living in a little bubble by yourself up there.
It takes a team to put this stuff together, and the videos and the graphics. I've nothing to say about that. I had very little to do with it, except to, we had some really, really good people working on that component, those components.
Well, we're looking forward to the next pieces coming out over the next couple of days.
Right, Wednesday and Thursday, we'll have more.
Fantastic. And if anybody has any thoughts or questions for Kevin, he's a Twitter king. So you can hit him up there or on other social media sites.
Just the name, that's all you need. Very
Kevin,
unimaginative Twitter handle.
Thank you so much for being here, for Making the Grade. Thanks for sharing your missing students investigation with us. We've posted the stories as well at Idaho News 6, so we can find them there if you want to go to our website. Kevin, appreciate all the good work and appreciate you being here for Making the Grade, my friend.
Thanks, Michelle. Have a good week. Stay safe, and stay safe, everybody out there.
Thanks, everyone.